All right, thanks everyone. Welcome to the Binary Defense webinar. It's slated for 1 hour here, so feel free to type in your questions along the way and we'll make sure we get those answered time permitting. My name is Stephen Marshowitz and I'm the VP of Business Development here at Binary. I've known Dave since I first got started heavily in security over 12 years ago, and it's really been amazing to see what Dave's done for the security community. Dave's counted on by many news outlets on a weekly basis. Probably you've all seen him on there somewhere. He's the founder of both Trusted Sec and Binary Defense. He's worked on what are now industry standards in the Penetration Testing Execution Standard, the Social Engineering Toolkit, Metasploit, and Artillery, and open source honeypot technique. And of course, he's the founder of DerbyCon, as you see in the picture right there. Binary Defense is the leading attack intelligence company in the world, built off of the direct research, penetration testing for hundreds of companies, and tool development that Dave and his team of industry experts have been leading over these many, many years. Our mission is truly to be an extension of your team and add on to where you leave off. So with the world, and especially the security world, being so complicated, we're a managed security service provider bringing together the core pieces of a security operations center for you. The amount of care and effort to think ahead on your behalf that the team here at Binary does is amazing to be a part of, it really is. The coordination between endpoints, SIM, threat intelligence in a SOC is key. And deception obviously has been a hot topic lately. Simple honeypots and honey files have moved into lures, breadcrumbs, and decoys, among many other terms. So if you're a company looking on deploying deception in your environment, what we've seen is other companies who have done this, they're able to, and really where deception comes in, they're able to detect threats faster, which helps reduce incident costs, have a higher quality of alerts, which reduces the cost of triaging them, and they can also use deception as an internal threat intelligence source, which we're seeing more and more often. Of course, there are challenges. So as I said, integration and coordination is key. We believe that it's important to make sure deception really is factored into your SOC, refining based off the both attack and threat intelligence. And of course, really where it all comes together is there's some human interaction to make it all really hum. It's the typical usual people, process, and technology. But as we all know, the quality of people is what really makes or breaks you. And with that, Dave, we'll pass it over to you.
Thanks, Steve. Appreciate it. And thanks for the introductions there and on Binary Defense and our vision platform and everything that we're doing here. You know, deception for me is a fun topic because, you know, coming up through the information security space and mostly focusing on the red teaming aspects, you know, understanding exploitation, post-exploitation, ways of getting access into environments, it gives me a unique perspective around what we can do on the opposite side to really start to detect what hackers do on a day-to-day basis. And so if it can create believable situations, things that make it believable for an attacker that becomes enticing, deception is something that is really benefits on the last line of defense to say, okay, our protective controls, our detective controls have all failed. You know, they're using something crazy or awesome to get into our network. What does that mean? And the deception piece on the back of it is the part that really trips up attackers. And if you especially make it believable or not, it's something that really helps. And so if you look at that and where we're at, I guess, in the information security space, you know, the tactics, techniques, and procedures of attackers are always continuously changing. The methods that they use, you know, new bypass techniques for getting around, you know, application control, new ways of exploiting or using, you know, fileless persistence methods that evade traditional detection criteria. And these are all things that change on a day-to-day basis and techniques that attackers leverage to get around the defenses that we put into place. And so with that, you know, if they're frequently changing, how do you actually go and detect those types of things? And so if you look at capabilities, I mean, there's a whole wide variety of sophistication when it comes to attackers. You have, you know, nation states, folks that have unlimited budgets. You have organized crime that are more focused on monetary gain and value. You have average, you know, hackers that have a wide variety of methods and motives to actually go into systems. And so if you look at a lot of these different capabilities, those are all threats that we face in our organization that we really need to defend against. And those tactics shift off of those different organizations based off of those different groups. So let's just say nation states targeting you. The techniques that they're going to leverage are going to be substantially different than organized crime. And depending on organized crime, there's all variations of those. Sophisticated levels of organized crime, folks that actually do obfuscation, that do techniques that they get around traditional technology. So in those types of cases, you have to build your defenses in place to withstand those types of attacks and withstand those types of capabilities that, things that are actively out there. And so if you look at with changing techniques, companies need to really start to build very proactive steps, both on the protection side, detection side, and deception, and it really requires multiple layers. And if you look at a good security program, it incorporates a lot of those different components. And if you look at what we're seeing out there in the news, I mean, the ability to weaponize attacks, to go after infrastructure, to cause mass amounts of chaos. And you have capabilities like, the NSA going after Russia and Russia going after the United States and North Korea weaponizing tools and everything else is going on in the back end. It's often really difficult to see what's really the different types of techniques that attackers are leveraging, let alone the ability to withstand attacks against unlimited budgets. And I'm always remember a specific story saying, or I was an executive of a Fortune 1000 company, and I went into this meeting, and the executives were like, well, you only have 50 folks dedicated to your security team. How are you going to defend against a nation state that has thousands? And that's a good question. At the end of the day, our goal isn't to stop 100% of the attacks; it's to minimize the damage to our companies. And if you look at the deception components around that, nation states have unlimited budgets and funding and everything else that's out there. How do we actually detect those types of attacks? And those are things that deception can really help out with a lot, because you can start to look at things like lateral movement, key pieces of information that attackers are going to go after. Those are all key things that we look at as far as what we can actually apply deception techniques to and go through. And I'll talk about that here in a little bit. So we look at layers for solid security practices. The first one is protection. Having a understanding around what's good in your environment, what's not good, and then from there building out deviations of patterns of behavior. A good example is still to this day most regular malware and things like that still leverage executables, even if it's using things like macro injection or PowerShell injection. Usually their second stage or the second technique is going to be to download an executable and run it. So if you have a good understanding of your baseline of your environment around protection, let's just say 90% of malware is going to be executables. If you have a good understanding around what executables you allow in your environment, which ones you don't, and you can baseline that and you can protect against that, now you've just reduced 90% of your noise out there. Now you're only focusing on 10%. And you can start to build more and more criteria around how to protect your infrastructure around that and reduce that noise even more. But what happens if an attacker leverages a specific type of attack to get around your protection? What do you do at that point in time? And that's really where the detection components come into play. What is abnormal patterns of behavior? What do they look like? What are certain things that go into your environment that are suspicious in nature? And then the last line of defense really being that deception component around, hey, they're using techniques that we don't have detection for. They're evading techniques that we've already built criteria for, that we spent a lot of time trying to understand these attack profiles. Now we're going to try to trip them up on the deception line. So think of it as multiple layers of defense for your organization, and deception becomes a big component of that. And if you look at current methods for protection, I mean, there's various amounts of new buzzwords that are out there today. I mean, if you look at what we're seeing around machine learning, most of the products out there today aren't truly machine learning. There's automation of tasks and things that happen around there. But in most cases, it's really more of the same. If you look at where antivirus was back in the 90s, the acceptable parameters for security was that antivirus needed to be effective 100% of the time, as in the ability to detect a specific type of variant that they knew was in their signature bases, and then alert the customer of those. You couldn't have a substantial amount of false positives. If you said, hey, we think 40% of this code is bad, but we're not sure, and popping up to the users, in the 90s, that would have been a big deal. What's happening in the market space now is that, companies are recognizing that there isn't anything that's going to be 100%, give you the 100% ability to detect what's actively happening out there. So that model has flipped. And so now you have more of a conceptual understanding that you are going to have false positives. You are going to be able to see weird things of patterns of behavior. and it may, it may be legitimate, it may not be legitimate, but it still requires a human to actively go in and investigate those to determine whether or not it is malicious in nature. So, protection is really in the same state as it was a long time ago. It's just the model has flipped differently to accept more of the, false positives, so that you can do investigations against things that may be edge cases or things that are abnormal. And so, talking about protection, for me, you see a lot of buzzwords in the industry. I still go to what stops me the most as an attacker. As I'm going through and going into infrastructure and breaking into things, what stops me as an attacker, and how do I have to raise my level up to a certain level to get around these types of techniques? And so, application control and application whitelisting to me is really what can build a solid, protection defense in place within your environment, because you can start to build an understanding and baseline of what's in your environment. What applications do you use? What vendors do you use that have code signing certificates? Really, getting more to that understanding around known good versus what's out there and looking for deviation. So for me, looking at the protection space right now, application control and application whitelisting to me is where the industry needs to move to as a whole. And you see that with with Windows 10 and above, you have Device Guard and everything that's going on that side. Microsoft also recognizes that stance as well. There's a lot of things that make that a solid defense when it comes to protecting against things that aren't known in your environment. So known good for me is the biggest thing. Understanding what's good, recognizing what's bad, and noticing that there's going to be deviations in that we're going to need to put exceptions into place to get things better in the future. And so let's talk a little about detection. What's interesting is you look at what hackers do and the ways that we attack infrastructure and attack organizations. It's really not magic. I mean, we're using a refined methodology around attacking an organization, doing our research, and then from there, compromising them. And so if you look at the compromise piece, all of our eggs are in that basket right there. Hey, exploitation just occurred on a system. From there, did we detect it? Did we not detect it? Whereas if you look at the patterns that we use, whether it's the NSA hacking or it's us as on the red team side, on the white hat side, our methodologies do not vary much in between. So everything from going after an organization from an exploitation standpoint of when we first compromise that initial user or web application, whatever it ends up being, if you don't detect that piece, usually after that the time window for actually detecting an attack starts to go up substantially, and the detection starts to go out the window. And so you're looking at detection, there's things that we have to focus on to really start to get better with that. And that becomes even more difficult with the shifting techniques that we see out there. Attackers changing their techniques that they leverage against an organization, using PowerShell injection instead, or using other methods for getting remote code execution onto systems. These are things that make it much more difficult for the detection side to look at all phases of the attack, from exploitation, post-exploitation, lateral movement, command and control infrastructure, persistence, hooks and footholds, till the exfiltration of data. And so those are things that become increasingly difficult as the techniques themselves start to shift over time. And it's even harder with the cloud. You look at what we have to deal with in the cloud, and in order for me to move to the cloud, I would need to have either the same level of visibility or greater going into an environment. Now think about that for a second. If the requirement was to move to the cloud, I would need to have greater, the same or greater capabilities. Could you say right now that where you're storing all your sensitive information meets that criteria? And so a lot of businesses will focus on cloud infrastructure. That's fine. I definitely think that the cloud is a fantastic resource from both a IT perspective, scalability, and everything else. But putting your data up in there is very peculiar when it comes to what makes you unique as an organization. A good example of that is Microsoft's Office 365. Office 365, is used by a substantial amount of folks. And this, by the way, is not a knock in any way, shape, or form to Microsoft. What they have to scale and what they have to do is absolutely insane from a scalability perspective, and to do security on top of that is really, really challenging when it comes to the volume that they have to hold. And so I decided to take a look at Microsoft's Advanced Threat Protection, their ATP service. And there's two components to that. There's safe attachments and safe links. Safe links, what happens is when you send an email to an Office 365 customer that has Advanced Threat Protection, when you send an email to them, the links themselves get rewritten. So, normally when you say, okay, hover over the link, to your users as a control to detect whether or not malicious activity has occurred, that kind of goes out the window now because safe links rewrite that and you can no longer see the original URL in there. And so that was one kind of negative thing. But the second thing was, in order for, remember I said before, we'd have to have the same type of protection or detection or greater in that environment. What happens with safe links is when you click that link, Microsoft does a quick check against it to see whether or not it's malicious or not, and then it passes you onto that site. What I found is that with safe links, they don't do any type of dynamic content inspection of the site at all. And it's essentially a static whitelist or blacklist of sites that they've already been reported as being malicious in the past. So if you're finding exploits or malicious code or things like that against that site, it's not going to pick it up. Even things that get picked up by antivirus, it doesn't use that as a scanning mechanism at all. It doesn't download executables. It doesn't run anything off of that site. It doesn't detect to see if there's exploits on the system itself. It doesn't do any of that. Same thing conversely for the safe attachments. Extremely easy to get around the sandbox and virtualization components of it. Essentially, if you can get past Windows Defender and a little bit of macro obfuscation, you're pretty good as far as getting around safe attachments as well. So even a company as large as Microsoft with their advanced threat protection pieces, it's much more difficult to even detect those types of attacks, let alone protect from what we're actually seeing there. And so here's some goodies for detection and some tips for detection that really make a big difference, and then I'll parlay into the deception pieces of it. But detection is a fun one because you're dealing with large, copious amounts of data, and if you have that data in some way, shape, or form, you can look for things, what we call hunting, but also look for indicators or build better detection criteria out there. And so for me, first and foremost, Sysmon is one of my favorites. It's still a bit buggy here and there, but there's some really great detection criteria you can build off of Sysmon itself. First and foremost, Sysmon is free. You can download it from Microsoft site today. And as part of that, they have what's called ETW, event log tracing, which exposes a number of different event logs. So if you go into, start, administrative tools, event viewer, and you can see inside of event viewer that there's an additional, under Microsoft logs, there's a Sysmon folder there that contains additional information for you that you wouldn't get out of normal event logs. Some good ones out of there, Mimikatz detection. You can actually go and do that, and that's the way that works is if you see vault.cli.dll being imported from multiple other locations, from binaries that may not be active on the system, or PowerShell or command.exe, if you see it being imported and something you want to actually go and analyze. Same thing for like PowerShell detection. PowerShell loads system.management.automation.dll and system.management.automation.na.dll. When those are actively being loaded into memory and it's not being done by a PowerShell process, you can look at that and say, okay, something's calling PowerShell that isn't actually leveraging PowerShell itself. But what's great with Sysmon is you can tie all those logs directly into a SIM or a central environment, or for Vision customers, you can tie it on back into that if you want to. And get your detection criteria directly into that as it's going in. There's so many different great things you can do with Sysmon. I can do a whole podcast on Sysmon itself, or a whole webinar on Sysmon. A couple of things. Sophos hates Sysmon, but that's been fixed in 6.0.3. So if you're running Sysmon with Sophos, you notice crashes before. If you upgrade to 6.0.3, that fixes a lot of those issues there. And it's like not PowerShell. NPS is a tool that one of our folks over at Trusted Tech wrote called Ben 10. And Ben wrote this tool called Not PowerShell. And essentially what it does is it actually injects into, or it pulls those, loads those, imports those system management automation DLLs and leverages PowerShell without ever calling PowerShell.exe. And so, a lot of next generation tools and things like that, when you go to like rename PowerShell.exe, for example, and call it something different, it'll actually evade their PowerShell detection. And so with something like NPS, you call that, and there's a new tool that Ben just released, Ben and Larry over at Trusted Tech, called NPS Payload, that uses MS Build to directly call NPS into memory without ever touching disk as well. So you're never even actually executing a binary. You're just calling it directly into memory. And so, with Sysmon, you can say, okay, if we see system.management.automation.dll being called by a PowerShell.exe or PowerShell_ISC.exe, then trigger an alarm and then look at that. And you want to be careful too. There's two directory paths for PowerShell. You have /Windows /system32 / Windows PowerShell /version 1.0 /PowerShell.exe, which is one path. Then you also have the C:\Windows /syswall64 /Windows PowerShell directories, which have those as well. So there's two paths you want to do for 32-bit compatibility to actually go and detect not PowerShell as it's actually occurring. And here's some suspicious processes to look for on the detection side. This is outside of Sysmon. These are things like, so Matthew Graber, if you're not following Matthew Graber on Twitter, he's a fantastic resource, and I've inserted his pictures randomly throughout this entire PowerPoint presentation because I'm a huge fanboy of Matt. But Matt and Casey Smith, Sub-T, so at Sub-T and at Matt Station, those two are two folks to really watch on that front when it comes to new research that's actively being done in different types of bypass techniques. Like BGInfo, for example, is used very, very heavily across the board and is one that you can actually call VB script and get remote code execution and is a signed binary. Same thing for like regSCR32, which has browser compatibility into it where you can download SCT files and execute them directly into memory. Same thing for certutil. Casey recently found that you can use the ping flag on that to do some malicious things. MS-build, run DLL32 for DLL ports. There's a lot of ways of being able to get remote code execution on Windows machines that don't call anything else other than legitimate Windows applications or binaries. So these are things that you should definitely be looking at from a detection standpoint to say, okay, why are these tools beaconing out, or why are these applications beaconing out the internet when they haven't before? And those are good detection criteria to look for things that might be using bypass techniques, more sophisticated type attack vectors. Pass-the-hash detection, from a pass-the-hash standpoint, it's actually fairly easy to detect nowadays. What you're looking for, is event ID 4624, which is successful logon, and then you're looking for login type 3, which is network logon type, so remote login happening from the network. Keylink 0, so if you're looking at pass-the-hash, most of the time it's going to be using SMB version 1 or SMB version 2 or above. But in most cases, like Metasploit, PSExec, Impacket, the other ones support SMB version 1, so the key length is going to be 0. And looking for the account name NTLM SSP, that's a pretty good indication. Now, if you were to remove the account name NTLM SSP and just look for event log ID 4624, login type 3, key length is 0, and you build active lists off of those to say, okay, Bob has logged into this machine. Let's track everywhere that Bob goes. You can actually see lateral movement happen across your network, regardless of the technique that they use, whether using PowerShell remoting or WMI or other techniques. You should be able to see that type of traffic happening real time based off of that specific event ID. So it's really important within group policy to have that, success and login failures for everything, not just your domain controllers, to actively go and have that there. And, on the detection side, detection is hard work. It requires a team of understanding, what the attacks are, how they're working, everything, from a new technique that Casey releases or Matt releases, all the way to, what you're seeing from a threat intelligence perspective and what adversaries are leveraging. And so it's a process where on the detection side, you really need to understand the red components of it, and that's on the vision side where we've had a lot of success. We have a whole team on that side that builds in that detection criteria real time to give it to our customers so that they have these detection capabilities happening all the time, and they don't have to worry about having that entire team dedicated to researching this on a given basis. So we've had a lot of success with that. All right, we're going to go ahead and do a unicorn demo, and the main purpose for this is to really look at what an attacker is doing when it comes to like PowerShell injection. This technique was a technique that Matthew Graber came out with a number of years ago, where you could basically leverage shell code, assembly code, to inject it directly into memory without touching disk within PowerShell. And so it's a very effective technique. It's used very much in the wild, and it's something that Unicorn, which is a tool that I wrote, leverages. And so with Unicorn, it's actually going to use a technique, bypass technique, that gets around what we call encoded command. And so if you're familiar with encoded command, essentially what you can do is you can take base 64 encoded commands, and you can inject your own code into there and get around execution restriction policies. It's a feature inside of PowerShell to do one-liner scripts, things like that in there. So the Unicorn, what it does is it actually uses a two-string variation that converts encoded command back down the road. So when you actually go to use it, tools that are looking for pattern recognition like encoded command aren't going to actually trigger and flag it. So we'll go and do a demo of that here really quick here. So let's go over to my machine here. And over here, we can see the social engineer toolkit, which is a tool that I wrote, and we're going to go ahead and create a attack vector called an HTA attack vector. And so we'll go ahead and launch this really fast, and what we're going to do is use the components of Unicorn of that to actually go through. So I'll go ahead and generate Unicorn. And what I'm going to do here is specify a interpreter payload, which is Metasploit. And I'm also going to give it my IP address. So I'm going to do 172.16.37.186. So 172.16.37.186 on port 443. And this will go ahead and generate all the code that we need to execute. Now, we could also do an HTA attack vector with this as well, but we want to show something a little bit more realistic on the social engineer toolkit side. I want to show what that code actually looks like. So we look at this code. Notice here it's going to be, a string variation here to string, which then encodes all of our code itself. And so it also chunks it up too. So if they're looking for like certain patterns of recognition or behavior, it'll actually chunk it up here. So if I look at look for a plus sign here, we'll actually see it chunks up the base 64 encoding as well, so that you don't even get to see that if someone's trying to decode it real time. And so it tries to get around that obfuscation-wise. You can do the same thing for like Excel documents, things like that as well to kind of get around it. So let's go ahead and run the social engineer toolkit. I'm going to generate a quick site that's going to do all this for us, and let's take a look at what we see. And I'm just going to go ahead and clone Binary Defense's website. And I'm going to tell the IP address to connect to. I'll use an interpreter shell, and we're all set. That's all we need to do to actually clone the site, inject all of our malicious code into it, and get around everything. And I'm going to go ahead and copy this IP address so I can go to it. 7.186. Got it. All right, we're ready to go. Over here, we're going to open up Internet Explorer. And let me kill anything running before the pass here. All right. And now we're going to go to our IP address. And we're going to go to a legitimate website, and we're simulating phishing here, obviously, and we're going to call the HTA attack method to actually compromise the machine. And no user would ever click open, I'm sure. As soon as they hit open, they hit allow, I'm sure no user would ever do that. And then over here, it takes a minute, but we're actually going to get direct access to their computer through the encoded command and Unicorn technique. So essentially what we're actually going to get here is a shell directly to their computer. If you think about it from a firewall perspective, we're sitting behind the firewall, we're on the end user's computer itself, and we have direct access to that computer. So it takes a minute for it to actually go and execute. But here we go, get access to the computer, get our interpreter shell, and we have direct access to the computer. Now, if I did things like, let's just say get system and other things, these are all indicators that we can possibly do. Now, I'm not running as an admin, so that's not going to work. But these are all things that we can actively look for attackers to actually go and detect on. But also obfuscation techniques that attackers will use to get around traditional detection criteria. Notice that we never called encoded command until we actually converted it back to string to actively go and use it. Here's actually a demo in Vision with that same exact thing. So we ran a bunch of techniques, and in that Windows machine that I actually compromised, we have Vision running in the background of that. So this is the Vision portal. You can see things like top host with alarms and whatnot, and command and control infrastructure and alarms by host and everything else. And one thing we can do in there, let's go to the alarms tab. We can actually see the different types of techniques that were actively being used at the time. So one is suspicious PowerShell command is identified. But notice here we see the syswall64 downgrade attack. We see suspicious connections with suspicious processes and network connections. We see encoded command eventually being called on the back end. So we're able to actively go and see things very quickly. And here you can actually see the command itself. Once it was actually converted from to string, you can see the original command that was run. That's the PowerShell-E command. and you know, the malicious code that was actively going and doing it. Same thing here. You can see the same thing. We can also see, you know, the raw output that actually happened from the attack. And then in code command, you know, we can see the actual commands that run as well. So, you know, a real easy way of being able to determine and detect through vision a lot of the different components around that specific attack as well. So kind of neat to see the unicorn demo and a lot of different things. What happens when you know, protection fails and all we have left is the deception pieces? And that's you know, the key part of this. You know, what happens when, you know, you attack something, you get around their defenses, and now, you know, you literally, let's just say, you know, using techniques where you can't you know, determine lateral movement, you can't determine, you know, persistence hooks. What do you do to actually find those? And that's really where deception comes into place. And deception for me is one of my favorite techniques because I really get to think as an attacker and also build the defenses as a defender as well. And so what are the techniques that we can leverage to actually go and do? And so if you look at building multiple detection phases, I look at it from a exploitation, post-exploitation, persistence hooks, command and control, you know, exfiltration data. There's multiple things in all those different phases that you can build out to hopefully trick the attacker into going after certain pieces of information or certain pieces of data that would make it very beneficial for them as the attacker itself. And if you look at that, I mean, during the French presidency, you know, they knew that they're going to be a target based off of what happened with the U.S. presidency, and that Russia was a big component, or you know, misinformation, things like that, campaigns, and hacking was a big deal. And what they did out in Paris is they actually created a whole separate fake infrastructure that was vulnerable to attack that simulated the French president-elect's infrastructure itself, and hackers broke into it and had a bunch of bogus information in there. So when hackers actually hacked into it, they didn't have anything. They weren't able to actually go and do it. And that's the thing. Like, if you look at where we can actually apply deception techniques to, think about it from an intelligence gathering perspective. If you put fake information out there on websites, you put fake information around your infrastructure, you put fake information around LinkedIn, you know, what technologies you're using, you put all of that out there, it creates a picture for attackers that isn't even real. So if they're looking at your defensive capabilities and they think you're running, you know, X and you're really running Y, you know, it gives you another added benefit around actually detecting what those attackers are doing. And think about it too from a exploitation perspective. You know, if I exploit a system and that system is supposed to be exploited and I have alarms going off like crazy anytime anybody's doing anything on there, then that's something that you can definitely detect on. Post-exploitation, you know, moving from system to system to system. Why not create an account that is an administrator on every single box and has the same password and monitor that account to see if it's actively ever used? You know, there's things that you can do to actively monitor for specific things to detect attackers in multiple different phases. And that's the important part about the deception components of it. It becomes something where you know, you really get to identify different phases of the attack and what attackers are doing and tripping them up in a lot of those different areas. So look at fake news on LinkedIn. You know, put fake mailboxes, expose CEOs' emails, email addresses, misinformation. You know, one of the big ones right now is the wire fraud transfers. You know, put the CFO's email address on the website and have it go to different boxes, and then, you know, have it discerned based off of that. You know, hey, I need you to wire certain things right now. Well, it's an email address that you only find on the public internet. You know, that, you know, post it up on your website. You know, post it up on different locations. Attackers are only going to go after that. Throw, you know, some SQL injection throw some SQL injection vulnerabilities up on websites that are in its own network segment in its perimeter, and see if they go after that as attackers. Things that can slow down attackers. And so we can start with the basics too. You know, looking at there's a project that open source project that I wrote called Artillery. And Artillery you can find at github.com/binary_defense. And Artillery is a honeypot tool that you can deploy that creates ports and protocols that emulate, you know, specific protocols themselves. So what I recommend, and what really messes us up with on the attack side, is, you know, a lot of companies have unused IP addresses on multiple IPs. So, you know, let's just say you have a /24 block or a /16. There's a number of IP addresses you're not going to be using in those different locations. Why not NAT all those to an auxiliary box so when someone goes to port scan you, it looks like every single port and protocol is open? Totally messes with attackers. You know, you know, it's hard to discern what is legit, what isn't, and their tools are going to start to bomb because they're starting to see a bunch of crazy data coming back from those. So, you know, NAT those to unused, you know, its own DMZ infrastructure. You know, place artillery on there, and then just wait and look. On the inside, just be active. You know, if you see artillery hitting, on the inside, you know that someone's scanning your infrastructure or your network. Honeydocs are also a great way to do things as well. We were actually having a discussion with a business partner of mine here, and as an attacker, what do I actually go after? When I'm looking at certain pieces of information, and the first thing I thought of is, well, usually I'll drop into a shell, and I'll go to the user's profile and look for things like passwords and things like that. And so why not create a user profile under C:\users or documents and settings, and make it a user account and keep sensitive data in there, fake passwords, fake user accounts, user accounts that may be legitimate in nature, but they have a fake password in there. So when you see failed login attempts for these specific accounts, you know that somebody's actually compromised your infrastructure, and you can get the source IP address for that. So putting that Honey documents in place. There's also a tool from the CIA that's now open source because it got leaked by WikiLeaks, but it's called Scribbles. And Scribbles actually injects watermarks into documents, and then from there, as soon as you open up the document, it beacons out and lets you know that there's actually someone that's opening the document itself. So there's a lot of ways to track specific things and entice attackers. Two of my most favorite ones are Kerberos tokens and ClearJack's passwords in memory. A guy named Fuzzy Security released a tool called invoke run as. You may be familiar with that from the net only command, like you do command prompt and you do net only. But with invoke run as, it's a PowerShell script. And what I'd recommend is creating a domain admin and make it a 70-character password. Make it the most complex password you've ever seen in your entire life. Then lock that password up in a safe. Give it every rights you possibly can imagine. Make it the most enticing user account that you ever wanted it to be. Like an attacker would really want to go after this. And then create a login script with the invoke run as PS1 file. And what it does is you can inject a fake password into there, and it injects that into memory. So what happens is if someone compromises the machine and goes to leverage something like Mimikatz, you'll actually see that username and password memory. Now give it that domain admin account, but give it a fake password, one that isn't accurate. And then look for event log IDs that are login failures. So if you see a login failure with that account that you created that should never be used in your environment at all, you know that there's an attacker specifically there. It works great and it's very believable. And again, you can always refine that and make it even more believable as you go along. Same thing for like LMNR, local link multicast name resolution, and NBNS, net browse name services. There's a tool out there called Responder and a PowerShell version called Envy. And what that does is it listens for multicast protocols and it says, hey, I'm looking for file server 1. Well, on file server 1, connect to me. And the victim will actually connect to the attacker's machine and pass net NCM credentials. So one of our folks, Ben, wrote a tool called Honeycreds, which actually sends LMNR across the network looking for usernames and passwords, sends fake usernames and passwords looking for those accounts. And what's nice about that is it actually creates a event log ID. So if you're creating a completely random computer name, completely random username, and completely random password, should LMNR ever successfully log into another machine? The answer to that is no. So if you ever see an event ID of explicit credentials were used to log into the remote system with this specific username, this specific computer name, then you know that someone's running Envy and Responder in your environment. So you can actually detect that because of that event ID of explicit login credentials were used to authenticate. So it's a really neat way of identifying Responder and Envy in your environment as well. Creating user accounts, create a local admin account. Make sure name-wise on all the systems they're the same. So let's just call the administrator account super admin, and randomize all the passwords. You can use Laps, which is a tool free from Microsoft. You can use Ships, which is a free tool from Trusted Tech that randomizes it all. And you look for invalid login attempts. You want to look for both 4624 and event log failures 4625 for those specific ones as well. So you can see, from a attacker standpoint, you should never see that account actively being logged into in any way, shape, or form, or see invalid login attempts as well. So it's a really good way of actually identifying those. Detecting SPN extracting, there's some great resources. Sean Metcalf, I'm a huge fan of. There's some great indicators that you can look for SPN accounts. First and foremost, create an account, make it look awesome, and give it an SPN role. I never use that account. And so if you ever see 4624, 4625 accounts for logging in for that account, someone went after your SPN. And so, you can see that as other attack vectors, but there's some great resources there too to watch for as far as looking for possible indicators on SPN accounts as well. And so those are some of the main areas around some quick wins around deception. I mean, deception is one of those things that really make a difference when it comes to how attackers go after infrastructure and the things that we can make things look believable. A funny story, I was actually doing a pen test for a customer, and I usually hack with like Linux and Windows. And so, I have a Windows machine that maybe I'm using for, protocol-specific type attack vectors, and I use Linux, for my tools and everything else. And I had a machine that had Vision loaded on it. And in Vision, we employ a lot of these similar techniques and more into that. And so I was actually hacking, and I had Responder open at the time. And I saw a service account that got sent over to us over the network. And it was interesting because, I had Responder open. I'm hacking away, and I see this awesome service account. Looks great. I'm like, oh, sweet, I got a service account for this specific customer. And so I started cracking it, finally cracked it, went to go use it, and I got an invalid login attempt from the IP address. And lo and behold, it was actually my virtual machine and Vision that got me, and it was literally my own code that I wrote that got me. So I actually got fooled by my own code that ended up snagging me and getting me in the deception side. So, if it looks believable enough, an attacker will definitely go after it. And these are just some examples of really going through and kind of doing some of those. And that's one cool thing about the Vision platform as well. If you're interested in that, definitely let us know. That's something that I'm passionate about and that I work, and spend most of my time on now is on the defensive side of things, as well as offensive. I still like breaking stuff. I'll never give that up. Just breaking something today, actually. But when it comes to the Vision platform, what we're doing here, the biggest thing that folks really struggle with is understanding those attack vectors. And that's one thing you get automatically inside of Vision is the understanding around, detection, deception. We have the ability to move the machines off of the network if it was compromised. So I just wanted to show some of those features because it's cool. And you can build this stuff too on your own if you have the time, resources, and the ability for it. But we have a whole team here dedicated to understanding those. So let's go through some of the Vision pieces of it. And here's the dashboard itself for Vision and how we actively go through and look for specific attacks. So here we have our dashboard with pretty alarms and everything else, and kind of go through a little bit of this. But what's nice about this is we have our assets page, which breaks down all of our assets and how we do it, and we can actually go into an individual asset and see additional information about it, such as containment mode, things like that. And so we can actually go down and put a machine in containment mode, which removes it off of the network and still allows communication back to the Vision instance itself. So we can essentially address a machine that's already been compromised into the environment and everything else. And you saw a little hint of that earlier where we had our alarms, where you can see different types of alarms like pass the hash or suspicious service creations, Mimikatz being leveraged, name pipe impersonation with Git system or other methods of techniques. So just different ways of being able to see multiple attack vectors as they're happening real time. So it's kind of neat. And let's take a look at this one. This is we're actually going to leverage specific attacks here. And in this specific one, we're going to do the SE Toolkit one as well, and we're going to see the similar attack that we did last time. But this is not using the unicorn obfuscation techniques. We're going to be leveraging just straight up encoded command as our method. Now, if you're not familiar with HTAs, HTAs are high content HTML files, and they're actively used for a lot of drive-by. So I definitely recommend blocking HTAs at the firewall and also through MIME type. So, making sure that because you can actually have the MIME type serve up HTA/application and not have an HTA extension, which gets around a lot of the content filtering pieces out there. So I definitely recommend blocking it based off of MIME type. But as we're seeing here, we're going to copy the binary defense side as well. Do the same attack, but not leveraging any obfuscation within Unicorn on there. So over here, we're going to go to our site, and we're going to browse again. You're going to see the same type of pop-up as before. So no user again, we'll click open. And then from there, we'll get our show. It's going to be a little bit quicker here. I'm going to fast forward. And over here, we should see, the alarm sets, the same type of types of alarms. So, suspicious PowerShell command identified, syswall64, and then we actually get the encoded command because we didn't actually obfuscate the code this time around. So we're going to see some of the, so here we actually see the two-string here. And then we're actually going to see the encoded command here in just a second. Let's go forward. There's the actual encoded command. We actually see the decoded command as well. So we can actually decode that information real time to see what's actually happening there. So real quick way of being able to determine what was actually malicious or not. let's also take a look at some other detection criteria here. Let's just say we already compromised the machine and we're getting into it. I'm going to go and use Mimikatz, right? Because I want to be able to see what information's out there. Now, since I exploited through a PowerShell command, I'm doing the 33-bit process because I use the syswall 64 downgrade tag. Now I'm going to migrate my process space to a 64-bit process so that I can first escalate myself to system and then use creds all, which is Mimikatz piece there. And we can see here just different credentials that we threw into memory to be able to see that. And so here with Envision, we can see both Mimikatz usage, process injection, service creation that was used for the name pipe impersonation, as well as other things here. So we can actually see the Mimikatz being actively loaded into memory real time, and then all the data that you need to make a determination. That would definitely be something that would be rare and unique to see in an environment. Next, now we're starting to get into the deception pieces, which is why we're probably all here. One thing that Vision does is it actually creates low, mid, high subset port ranges. So when you go to port scan something, when you're sweeping the network, you get to see honeyport attacks happening. So as you go to actually port scan the systems, it'll actually detect early warning signs of that if someone's port scanning the system itself. So we can see here, we have a honeyport attack. Click on that. Then we can see the actual ports that were used and then the remote attackers' IP addresses. So you know that someone's sweeping your network looking for a specific attack. The next one, firing through the different ways of attacking. What we're going to do next is we're going to use LLM&R with Responder. And what's nice about Responder, you'll see here, is it's going to poison the request and send back a specific response. Now, what we're going to do as an attacker, and this is all hypothetical, right, inside the demo, is once we see this NetNCMV2 poison, what we're going to do at this point in time is we're going to crack that offline and then try to use that password somewhere else. And in a lot of cases, you can make that a pretty easy password to actually go and crack so the attacker doesn't spend a substantial amount of time, or you can make it complex and make them take a lot of time. What we're going to do here is we're actually going to launch a Metasploit shell, and we're going to go and actively go and run it. And once we're in Metasploit, we're going to use what's called psexec, which is just the method of communicating to that system, leveraging SMB. And we're going to use the username that we just captured, which is the Kronos1-DA service. And that was one that we created on the machine itself that Vision used as a fake one. And we set just our password. Let's say we crack that password. And we go to exploit, we're going to get a failed login attempt. This is using deception and showing deception real time of what you can actually build as well. We go back here, and we can actually see the honey token usage as it's actively used. So we can see that an attacker was actually going and using this based off a broadcast or using a technique to try to use that account that was used from a honey token perspective. So easy way to snag an attacker pretty quickly. And so if you look at what we were trying to talk about, it's just some good examples around deception and detection on the Vision line. But the same things you can definitely try to incorporate in your program. My goal around this webinar is the hope that deception becomes more and more prominent in organizations because it is something that has been very successful when it comes to us attacking organizations as well. If you look at the three components around a security program that really make a big difference, the protection piece of it is first and foremost, but what if that fails? Detecting that component of it, and then from there, the last line of defense really being the deception pieces of it. So that's it for the webinar piece of it. I'm going to pass it over, to Steve Marshowitz here, who is going to, field some questions, and we'll kind of go from there.
Thanks, Dave. Yeah, we have quite a few questions. The first one is about if they're a small company, they keep adding more tools and more things to it. So deception has been another one of those. They have more agents, more network devices, and companies are still being breached. Why does this extra layer help?
Yeah, that's a good question. And again, kind of reiterate the question too. If an organization already has a lot of this in place, a lot of protection pieces in place, and companies are still being breached, why does deception help? And think of deception as really being that last line of defense. The way that attackers go after your organization may change and vary, and your detection may not be up to speed with the level of sophistication or the types of bypass techniques that attackers are going to be leveraging. So deception really ends up being that simulated environment that attackers can leverage to go after and hopefully that you're tripping them up in some of the last stages of the exploitation piece. And think of it as deception is that is it. I mean, you know, your detection has gone out the window. Attackers have gotten around it. Your deception is a way of putting enticing things out there to really make it difficult for attackers to differentiate between the two, and then from there get snagged as they're going along.
Do you do network and data deceptions and virtualization as well?
Yeah, so from a network and data deception piece, you know, from a networking perspective, there's definitely false pieces of information. Like if you look at LLM&R, that's going to be network-based. You look at other ways of going about it data side-wise. Absolutely, you know, there's honey files you can place on systems that were mentioned before. From a virtualization standpoint, virtualization is no different than other operating systems themselves. So, you know, operating systems are going to be spun up in a virtual environment, and deception can be definitely applied the same principles as, you know, an endpoint agent or endpoint system, endpoint laptop, or a server itself. So virtualization really makes no difference as far as deception techniques and what you would actively go to deploy to those.
Do you have any suggestions on a sysmon replacement?
Do you have any suggestions on a sysmon replacement? So, you know, sysmon is free from Microsoft, you know, and what it does is it exposes event log tracing or ETW. There's definitely ways of being able to query and pull that data out, but no specific product that is sitting there extracting ETW, and that's its only focus. So sysmon is really the main one, and from a sysmon perspective, what it's giving you is, you know, a number of different other areas like process create, process terminations, image load, ways of detecting other things that are being loaded into memory. You know, some strange detection criteria that you can build off of it. You know, conversely, you could probably do the same thing via kernel driver or other things. You know, but sysmon is probably one of the more largely adopted ones from, you know, originally from Mark Russinovich over at Microsoft and still maintained over there. I think they just released a new version on May 22nd, which kind of put that through. You know, I wouldn't recommend a sysmon replacement, you know, but I'd also look at what you can get from ETW and how you build your detection. I think that's the most important piece.
You talk about detecting not PowerShell attacks. Is that something that's actually happening in the real world?
Yeah, absolutely. You know, if you look at, we've actually seen direct attack vectors in the wild happening that are calling system.management.automation.dll without actually calling PowerShell. And right now, you know, it definitely appears to be more you know, groups that are better at bypass techniques, more on the organized crime front side that are leveraging this specific type of technique. But it's definitely becoming more and more prominent as we see it getting more and more popularity. So definitely see NPS, not necessarily Ben's tool, but the technique itself of being able to call PowerShell without actually leveraging PowerShell itself as a way of circumventing a lot of the PowerShell detection that's out there today, being leveraged quite frequently.
You said deception should be its own security program. So we're a small company. We don't have staffing to do security the right way. How much care and feeding is there in deception? And how much, you know, additional time should be invested towards that versus other methods?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I made the comment before that I think this should be a dedicated field, but it really is as much time as you can dedicate to it. And what's nice about deception is that once it's stood up and running, you don't really have to make a lot of changes to it. Like let's just take the LLM&R thing with the login script, you know, the credentials in memory, you know, the other components that we talked about around you know, user profiles with documents in them. Once those are set up and you have, you know, the alerting happening around failed login attempts around those accounts and everything else, it really shouldn't take a substantial amount of effort of upkeep for those. And so it's kind of a sit it and forget it until you see that alarm. And when you see that alarm, you know, obviously you have a major problem on your hands that you need to investigate from an incident response standpoint. But overall, you know, it really shouldn't take a substantial amount of time once it's all set up and running. But that's the thing, like, you know, you want to continuously evolve your deception pieces. So if you have the ability, you want to continuously make more and more, you know, deception pieces in your environment to make it much more difficult for attackers.
Follow-up, can you include threat assessment results into deception? Or how would you do that to make it better?
Yeah, when you look at threat assessments, you know, threat assessments are supposed to be an understanding around the different threats that you face in your organization and the threat actors that would be specifically targeting you. So let's just say, you know, your demographics is financial, and, you know, Fin7 or other groups are specifically targeting you, or, you know, whatever ends up being. understanding your threats and their techniques and building deception criteria off of that is super important. So I think you can definitely model your deception criteria and techniques off of the types of patterns that your threat actors are leveraging that you know about. Now, the only concern about that is that, if they start to change their tactics, you also need to change your deception criteria as well and what you're doing to be able to trip them up. So it needs to be a moving target when it comes to what deception you're putting in place and ultimately the types of techniques you leverage.
There's been a lot of talk about using deception for Internet of Things. Can you expand on why and why you're saying it's a good idea?
Yeah, so Internet of Things is such a large word. It could be any device. It could be a home thermostat all the way to industrial control systems that are managing specific processes like PLC devices and others. And so you have different operating systems, different platforms, but you also have a much larger and increased attack surface because a lot of those devices a lot of times don't have a lot of security. You see them with medical devices, you see them with manufacturing plants and shop floors. You name it. Those are big things. So placing systems around them, that have deception capabilities in there really makes it much more difficult, for an attacker to discern, whether or not it's valid or not, tripping up sensors as you go along there. So it's definitely something that, from a vision perspective, surrounding systems around IoT things with vision installed is going to make it, a lot of those early warning indicator attack vectors help in actually detecting them in those types of environments.
Just one or two more. Machine learning and big data. Are you putting a lot on Twitter about it? Is there any of that seems good, or where does this fit in with that, if it does at all?
Well, machine learning is a concept about talking about how machines can learn off of large data sets. So taking the big data concept. And so how do you apply principles of machine learning? Now, a lot of the tools and the technology you see out there today that tout machine learning aren't even close to being machine learning. They're still large conglomerate amounts of data, but they're using humans to apply better rules to hopefully enhance their detection. It's not machines applying analytics and data towards other pieces of code to fix that code. So I think if you look at where machine learning is right now, we're still in a very, very early phase around machine learning. Now, I definitely think it has applied principles in security, and we leverage components of that. As far as automation tasks and learning off of large data sets to be able to get better on detection. But machine learning really still has a long ways to go when it comes to applied principles and information security, and something that just isn't there yet, and it's really a big marketing thing for a lot of big companies.
You talked about cloud. Does deception work in cloud and virtualized environments both?
Yeah, if you look at cloud infrastructure, a lot of folks have different variations of that. But if you're looking at like an Azure platform and other ones where you have the full stack around the operating system and everything else, deception absolutely works in those. And those are going to be targets for me as attackers, by the way. I'm going to go after that as far as an attacker is concerned. I'm going to compromise your internal network and try to bridge it over to your cloud infrastructure, or compromise an admin of your cloud infrastructure, and then from there try to get over access to it. So you can definitely employ techniques around that as far as cloud infrastructure is concerned, and being able to identify attacks in your cloud that works both on-premise and off-premise as well. So I think it's super important to incorporate that as far as deception techniques go into your information security program.
Okay, thank you very much. I want to thank you, Dave, for taking the time today with us and teaching us about deception. This will conclude the webinar for Binary Defense on deception. Make sure you check out our next one, the next webinar coming up in September 14th. It's called Hunting After Dark, Who's Watching, with Nick Douglas and Todd Kaltenborn, that will be coming up next month on the 14th. Thank you very much for your time, and we look forward to talking to you soon.